Right, well, I hope you can all see that window, and that's the topic of the talk. A few acknowledgements to start. First of all, there's a few pattern book pictures, and I thank the Stoke City Archives and WRD for their permission. I also would like to thank the Shelley Group for having been energetic and copied all the pattern book pictures and made them available to the other two clubs. And also to fellow collectors who have allowed me to photograph pieces in their collections or sent me pictures. Well, a bit of background to start. First of all, medieval court dining. In that stage, sugar was a very expensive luxury. It's brought to Europe by the Crusaders and remained expensive until they started producing it in South America and Brazil, and then, of course, the West Indies and so on. And sugar was one of the ways you could show off how much money you had. After meals, they believed that sugar-coated seeds and wafers and sweet spiced wines helped your digestion. And after that, they brought out fresh plates to serve it on. The ruler then retired, and that's where the word dessert came from, a French verb. And for the wealthy, as I said, dessert courses became show of your wealth and also a show of how skilled your kitchens and staff were. And they employed special artists to make sugar sculptures, some of them very elaborate. These are two from the Getty Museum collection, but some of them they could break up and guests could take pieces home. Others, I imagine, were so elaborate that they got reused. Early porcelain dessert services were very expensive. And this one was one made from Napoleon, 256 pieces, and it ended up with the Rockefellers. In the 19th century, which is getting nearer our time, porcelain became much less expensive. And in England in particular, they started making quite a lot of it. And they made plates that had very decorative centres that weren't intended to be cut on, which would have destroyed the centres, and they used them to serve up at the end of the meal, candied fruits and things like that. And some of the settings included some very, very elaborate supporting pieces, éperons and comports, often silver, sometimes porcelain, and sometimes using glass serving plates and so on. And that brings us to the late 1880s when Wileman Company began making dessert services, and this is one of their very early ones. The material, they didn't have an earthenware factory until 1894, so when they started in the late 1880s, obviously it had to be china, and of course the test for china is to hold it up to a strong light and see if it's translucent, and this is the bottom of a comport looking up, and you can see against a bright sky how translucent it is. And I'll just mention why I'm restricting my talk to China dessert services is because about mid-1920s, they'd pretty much gone out of fashion, and Shelley, when they made desserts, and these are the ones that appear in the catalogues with lists of 6 plates and comport and serving dish and so on, were made out of earthenware, which they euphemistically called semi-porcelain. And they used the patterns they used for dinnerwares and so on. What's the distinguishing features of desserts? Well, they had generally very decorative borders, very decorative centres, and some of them were elaborately hand-painted by specialist china painters. The components, generally comports, serving dishes, and plates, but not all plate shapes had comports or serving dishes. Well, let's see what we can say about starting date for it. The very earliest ones have the 2 back stamps on the top left, and the one in the far left is the very first back stamp that Wileman and Company introduced when they registered their first Japan pattern, and it only appears with that pattern, and it seems to have travelled with that pattern because it was still being used way back in the early 1900s and 1910s, whenever that pattern appeared. The second one is the one that is mostly on the early pieces, but I included the whole range here. So you'll see that they use patterns right through from a while when they dropped the logo and just had the Foley China. And then, of course, they couldn't get exclusive use of Foley, so they introduced a Shelley back stamp in 1910. Registration records tell us a little bit more about starting dates, and we find there was a Alexandra tall comport registered in January 1888, and they also made a low version which carried the same registration number, and they also registered a pattern number 540, and it's only known on Alexandra plates and comports. At least I haven't seen it on anything else. Some of you may be able to enlighten me. And it would seem that it was registered specially for comports and dessert plates with Alexandra shape. A note about the 500s patterns, because these are a little bit unusual, but some Japan patterns that were first used on teaware and had usually 3000s numbers were given new numbers when they were used on early dessert wares. And I suspect that this is because what happened was they had to engrave new plates, much bigger plates, to put on plates and comports and so on. And so they obviously had a new 500s pattern book, but it's not survived, and so it doesn't give us any help with dates. But I'd ask you to note that the 500 patterns on round shapes are lower than those on Alexandra's. And so I can, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Pattern books, the very first patterns that mention desserts, and that's the one on the bottom left. It says dessert. You'll note spelt desert with one S. They seem to be free spellers in those days, and it's variously dessert or desert. And it doesn't give a picture, but it just says gold convolvulus on blush. The four patterns immediately preceding it, the ones on the, and I think I've got those round the wrong way, actually. Oh, no, that's right. 608, for example, 080, which immediately in front of it, and a couple of following patterns were obviously for round plates, and they probably were for desserts, but it's a bit hard to tell. Now, let's just summarize what we know. Back stamps don't give us enough information. Registration records show that they were making Alexandra in early 1888. Patterns don't start till till 1890, but the 500 suggests that round desserts were probably a little bit earlier. Well, let's see how they evolved. The earliest were obviously rounds and Alexandra, and they all seem to have Japan patterns. At least they're the only ones that I've been able to find. But by the 1890s, there were pattern books listed for dessert, and they were of the same sort as were often used for teaware, but for big patterns used in the centres. Obviously transfer patterns where they transferred the outline, and then they would have been hand coloured. And to the two shapes, they soon added four more: Roseberry, Daisy, Gainsborough, and Rococo. And the dates below are the dates from the pattern books. First date tells you when I believe I can recognize the shape in the illustration. And the second shows when the Roseberry name or the Gainsborough and so on, Rococo names were actually first used. Gainsborough always seemed to have a name. Variously, they abbreviated it down to Gainsborough, and they sometimes had a dessert on the back end of it. Daisy's not named, but it has a registration number for Daisy teaware, and it's clearly the same shape as a Daisy teaware plate and saucer. So it seems reasonable to call it Daisy. And if we look at some of the early patterns, this is how I believe I can recognise when the earliest pictures for the shapes were, and the one on the left shows a border, which I believe must be roseberry, and the one on the right is very, very clearly Daisy. And so that's where I got the dates. Now, comports, some shapes, 3 of them, in fact, round, Alexander and roseberry, had both high and low versions. Rococo, I only know of 1 height of comport, but people might be able to add to that. And Daisy and Gainsborough don't seem to have comports. Now, in 1893, Percy Shelley went to the Chicago exhibition to study the American market. And there's a little bamboo cup which has pictures of that World Exposition. And I don't know whether he got an order from some American company that wanted to produce souvenirware or sell souvenirware at it, or whether he took some samples over, but whichever way, this is a connection with the Chicago exhibition. Anyway, he's reported as coming back from that and deciding that for export in particular, they really needed to improve the quality. Obviously, Wileman quality wasn't considered to be up to some of the other suppliers. During the 1890s, the pattern book entries increased rapidly, and I've said there 1890, 1905, about 140. After 1910, they dropped right off. There were only 10 more entries, and the last was in 1917. And word of caution here, because there's some patterns on Round and Gainsborough, and I really don't know whether they were intended to be for just dining, or whether they were actually part of dessert sets. But I take it that the elaborate hand-painted ones were certainly not used just for ordinary dining. Now, I said that a lot of patterns were printed and outlined and filled in the same way as they decorated their teaware. But in the early 1900s, they started employing a few specialist china painters. And some of these were obviously paid by the piece, because you can see this extract in the pattern book says down the bottom, centre painted by Micklewright, 2 grouse, 4 shilling cents. I don't know how they judged the worth of it, but they seem to have had 2 shilling, 3 shilling, right up to 5 shilling. Now, these named China painters, there weren't that many of them. I just quickly like to review who they used. Micklewright was by far the most prominent, and he has 17 pattern book entries, and some of them are series. And here's an example of a pattern book entry, this one on a Gainsborough plate on the left, but the only picture I've been able to find of it in practice is on a round plate, and you can see how it got interpreted. Stephen Alcock was another painter that they used. He was listed 5 times. The only piece that I have ever seen with his signature on it is the one shown. But he did a number of series. 4 of the entries show that they were series. William Mussell was another one, but he is listed for 6 plate centres. I have never seen a Wileman example, and so this shows the sort of work he did, but on coping plates. And Jack Hewitt is another one. He's only 1 entry, and he's supposed to have done female vignettes. And the only examples I can find are on other people's pottery. So you can see the style of ladies that he did. Frederick Reed, we all know about. He was the art director, and he is listed for 4 times for centres by Reed, and some of them are obviously series. And these are pattern book entries, because I haven't been able to find pictures of any originals if they survived. Right, well, now let's look at a few examples. The earliest ones, as I've said before, were all Japans, and here is an example of a round with a Japan pattern. Micklewright, here's a set of 12 plates. Now, these didn't have comports or serving dishes to match, as far as I know. That may be because people didn't use those comports, or they might have had some fancy silver ones and so on. It might have been a bit like tea sets, where you could order a tea set and you had to order the teapot as an extra. But a lot of people preferred to use their already existing silver teapots. And here's a few centres from his bits. And you can see these are all game birds. And the one on the bottom right, prairie chick, is a grouse found in the American prairies. And so this is a set we own, and we got it from America. So I presume it would have been made principally for export, although a lot of the birds occur both in North America and in England. And a couple more round deserts, later ones, where you can see they're now just gilding them. They're not putting hand-painted or transfer patterns on them. It brings us to Rosebery, the next shape. Here's a set of 6, dated 1904. And another one with a 1909 pattern. And Rosebery was used for Micklewright paintings and for just transfer prints. And here's an 1899 plate. And the one on the right, I suspect is by Micklewright, but I can't find a signature anywhere, so I don't know. But these are definitely Micklewright, and the one on the right is a serving dish. Ashbourne pattern was widely used on teaware. We've got it on a little coffee pot. We've also got it on a little lidded gem box. Old Sevres was another pattern that was quite widely used. That brings us to Gainsborough. And here's a photo of a set of 12 fish plates. And you can see it had quite an elaborate border. I don't know comports or serving dishes for that set. And some more Micklewright centres. And the border on the left one was called game border, and it was used on quite a few with pictures of game birds or the game, fish and things. And a couple more, and that we saw a detail of a pattern with the crayfish and shells and so on, and you can see it's been used just on a plate. And this one is a 2 shilling game centre, the one on the left. So I don't know whether you got 2 shillings for one bird and 4 shillings for 2 birds, or quite how it worked, but anyway, or whether it was just inflation with time that went up over the years. That brings us to Rococo desserts. And here, some of them had very elaborate borders. They had a raised pattern around the edge, which they often picked up in gilding or another colour, and some sort of transfer pattern in the middle. They were also used by Micklewright for his china paintings. You can see here a serving dish and a plate. And a couple more by Micklewright. And again, you'll see these border patterns treated differently again, with a red background and gold. Now, the set on the left has 4 very well executed ladies. And I thought for a while they might have been Hewitt's lady vignettes, but female vignettes, but they appear on Rococo, and there's no mention in the pattern book of this, and there's no pattern number, and there's no artist signatures that I can find. These are some, again, that came from America, I think. And a few more Rococo desserts, the same pattern used on both plates, but a different border treatment. And again, a pattern number not known for the one on the right, but it's obviously in the era when they were doing all their sunset scenes on gems and various other wares, and a different treatment of Rococo again on the left. So that brings you to the end of all the pictures I can find, and most of them are singles because desserts don't seem to have survived very well, not as complete sets anyway. But what we can conclude is that Wileman and Shelley made dessert china services from the late 1880s to the 1920s and moved to semi-porcelain. The earliest ones were Japan's on 2 shapes, and then they added them, and they became very popular in the 1890s and early 1900s. And then they dropped right off and went out of fashion by about 1917, well, probably the time of the First World War. So thank you for listening. That's about all I know, but some of you may be able to supplement that information.